Welcome back to my channel. If you are visiting this channel for the first time, you are also highly welcome. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the paranasal sinuses. I've done a part 1, part 2, and part 3 lectures on the nasal cavity. Please kindly go and check those lectures up to keep yourself updated. But for this class, we would be looking at the paranasal sinuses. The paranasal sinuses are hair-filled spaces that are located around the nasal cavity. So you have the nasal cavity around the central part of the face, and you have paranasal sinuses being arranged like a room around it. So you have paranasal sinuses as hair-filled spaces that are located within bones seen around the nasal cavity. So you have 4 paranasal sinuses. These paranasal sinuses, as they are 4 in number, they are seen in pairs, which means that they are 2, and they are also bilateral, which means that you have one on the right and also one on the left. And they are so named based on the name of the bones they are located. So it depends on the name of the bones where the sinuses are located. That will be used as a basis for naming the sinuses. So we have 4, as we've said. We have the frontal sinus. The frontal sinus is seen to be located above the nasal cavity. And as the name implies, we've already stated that these sinuses are named based on the name of the bones that they are located within. This means that the frontal sinus is located within the frontal bone. And we know that the frontal bone is located in the anterior forehead region. So this is where we have the frontal sinus. This frontal sinus is highlighted here in green. We already said that they are paired and they are also bilateral. You see one on the right, and you see another frontal sinus on the left. And in this image beside it, in the side view, this is where we have the frontal sinus that is also highlighted here in green. Then the second sinus is the ethmoidal sinus. The ethmoidal sinus is located, as the name implies, within the ethmoid bone. This is where we have the ethmoid bone here highlighted in purple. The ethmoid bone is located at the roof of the nasal cavity, and of course between the 2 orbits. So this is where the ethmoid bone is located, and of course it is located within the ethmoid bone, as the name implies. This is seen at the lateral part of the nasal cavity. We know that the frontal sinus, as we initially described, is seen above the nasal cavity. The ethmoidal sinus is seen to be located lateral to the nasal cavity, and this is what is highlighted here in purple. And on this image here, this is where we have the ethmoidal sinus. We also have the sphenoidal sinus. This is the sphenoidal sinus here that is harrowed in red. The sphenoidal sinus, just as the name also implied, means it is located within the sphenoid bone. So this is what is shown here in this image. In this image, the sphenoidal sinus is not seen in this image because it is located behind the nasal cavity. And this is like a front view, so it is not projected in this image. But if you look at the side view, you see that this sphenoidal sinus, harrowed here in red, is seen to be located behind the nasal cavity. We have the nasal cavity somewhere around this region. The frontal sinus is located above it. The ethmoidal sinus is seen to be located lateral to it, while the sphenoidal sinus is seen to be located posterior or dope to the upper part. So this is where the sphenoidal sinus is located. Then we also have the maxillary sinus. This is the maxillary sinus in this image that is located within the maxillary bone. So we have 2. We have one on the right, and we also have another one on the left side. So this is the maxillary sinus, and in this side view, this is where the maxillary sinus is also located. So this sinus is located inferior lateral to the nasal cavity. If you look at the position of the ethmoidal sinus and also the maxillary sinus, looking at this image, you see that these 2 sinuses are located lateral to the nasal cavity. This is the nasal cavity in the central part, but you see that if you try to relate the position of the ethmoidal sinus and the maxillary sinus, you see that even though both are located laterally, the maxillary sinus is located more lateral and of course more inferior to the ethmoidal sinus. So if you try to relate the position of the ethmoidal and the maxillary sinus, that is how it will be projected. While we have the frontal sinus located above it, then we have the sphenoidal sinus as shown in this image located behind, that's posterior to the nasal cavity, although it is at the upper part of the posterior region of the nasal cavity. So that is how that is presented in terms of their position around the nasal cavity. You can see that these paranasal sinuses are seen as airfield spaces that are located within the bones that are seen around the nasal cavity. And you see them being arranged around the nasal cavity. This is going to be an interesting lecture. Please write down with me as I unfold some other basics that you need to know as students of anatomy. Going further on the characteristics, we know that the paranasal sinuses are airfield spaces that are located around the nasal cavity, and that is where the name also is drafted from. It means that they are sinuses that are located around the nasal cavity. So that is why we have the establishment of the name paranasal sinuses. So let's dive in to see the characteristics of these sinuses. We've already established that they are airfield spaces that are located within the bones that are arranged around the nasal cavity. These airfield sinuses are seen specifically in 3 neurocranial bones and 1 viscerocranial bone. So you see that if you try to divide the skull, which is the cranium, into the 2 subdivisions that it is made up of, we have the neurocranium above, and we have inferiorly here, we have the viscerocranium. Within the neurocranium, we have 3 of the neurocranial bones where these paranasal sinuses are located, and these include the frontal bone, the ethmoidal bone, and also the sphenoidal bone behind. So those are the 3 neurocranial bones that are seen to create airfield spaces that are referred to as a paranasal sinuses. While 1 viscerocranial bone, which is the maxillary bone here, is seen to contain airfield space that is referred to as paranasal sinuses. They are paired, as we've stated, which means that there are 2, and they are also bilateral, which means that you have 1 on the right and 1 on the left. So for all the 4 paranasal sinuses, you have 1 on one side and you have another one on the other side. These paranasal sinuses are also connected to the nasal cavity. We already established that they are airfield spaces that are located around the nasal cavity, and the aim of being arranged around the nasal cavity is structurally to have a connection with the nasal cavity, and they connect through their ostia. So we have the ostium of each paranasal sinus connecting it to the nasal cavity. This is where we have the nasal cavity. So you have the ostium here of the maxillary sinus of this part connecting the maxillary sinus on the left side with the nasal cavity, and this is what is highlighted here in black. And we also have another ostium here connecting the right maxillary sinus with the nasal cavity. So this is how you have the ostia connecting the different paranasal sinuses with the nasal cavity. And is also seen to be lined by respiratory epithelium, which means that the type of epithelium that is seen to line the nasal cavity is also seen to be lining the paranasal sinuses. And we know that the respiratory epithelium specifically is related to the stratified columnar type of epithelium. This epithelium is specifically designed for respiratory purposes. And this type of epithelium is what is also seen to be lining the paranasal sinuses. So what does this imply? It means that the activities or the functions that the nasal cavity can perform will also be exhibited by the paranasal sinuses. This is what it means, because you already have the gadget to do so. If the nasal cavity can help to filter air, can help to warm air, and also humidify the air due to the fact that they are lined by this type of epithelium. And this same type of epithelium, which is affiliated to the stratified columnar type of epithelium, is also what is seen to be lining the paranasal sinuses, which means that they can also perform that function. And this is where one of the functions of the paranasal sinuses are also be drafted towards. We'll see in the next slide the functions of the paranasal sinuses, and we'll see that also involved in processing inspired air due to these characteristics. So this slide, we'll be looking at the functions of the paranasal sinuses. Talking outside respiratory function, these paranasal sinuses, we already said that they are airfield spaces located within the cranium. So these spaces will help to reduce the weight of the skull. If you try to compare the weight of a compacted bone and a bone that has spaces in it, you see that the one with spaces, of course, will have a lesser weight. And this is the basis onto which the paranasal sinuses help to reduce the weight of the skull. So they help in the reduction of the weight of the skull, and also they help to increase the resonation of sound. There can be an increased amplification of sound because of these spaces that are created. Also, the paranasal sinuses are seen to contain specific cells involved in immune function. And because we already stated in our previous slide that they have connection with the nasal cavity through their ostia. So they are helping also in a way to support the immune defense of the nasal cavity, because whatever they exhibit will also be relayed into the nasal cavity. And also because we stated in our previous slide that they are also lined by respiratory epithelium, which is a ciliated to stratified columnar type of epithelium. We know that this epithelium are seen with cilia on their free surfaces, and this of course will help to process the inspired air, because the air that is coming from the external environment is not seen to be pushed down the respiratory tract just like that. This air needs to be processed. So this air will need to be processed and conditioned into the type that the respiratory tract can accommodate. These paranasal sinuses are seen to open into the nasal cavity through its lateral surfaces and also the roof. See, this is the frontal sinus, this is Phenoidal Sinus. The ethmoidal and the maxillary sinus are not seen in this image because they are being chopped off. They are seen on the lateral side of the nasal cavity. And this is the lateral wall of the nasal cavity through which most of the paranasal sinuses are drained into. We also have a paranasal sinus draining into the roof of the nasal cavity. So let's look through on the developmental anatomy of the paranasal sinuses. The facts on this slide are also relevant to students studying anatomy. For paranasal sinuses, because they are seen as air-filled spaces that are arranged around the nasal cavity, during the developmental process, they develop as a result of invagination of nasal mucosa into the surrounding bones where we have these paranasal sinuses located. So we have the nasal mucosa driving into these spaces, and they begin to develop within the space. And that is why they have the same configuration as the nasal cavity. Only the maxillary sinus and also the ethmoidal sinus are seen to be present at birth, while the frontal and the sphenoidal sinus will be seen to develop after birth. But the maxillary sinus is seen to develop first. This is where it is located within the maxilla. It is seen to develop first, and this is followed with the ethmoid. This is where we have the ethmoidal sinus. So these two sinuses are what we see to be present at birth, while we have the frontal and the sphenoidal sinus developing after birth. For the frontal sinus, it starts to develop around the age of 2. This is where we have the frontal sinus here above within the frontal bone. Then the sphenoidal sinus will develop earlier than that. But it is known that the sphenoidal sinus tends to develop slowly. But generally, the sinus develops as a small air-filled space, and this tends to increase as development proceeds. And this increase in the size of this paranasal sinuses is as a result of the increase in the skull. So as the skull also increase, you expect that the paranasal sinuses also will tend to increase in cavity or to increase in size. So the increase in the skull will also push this drive for the paranasal sinuses to also increase. But initially, when they develop, they are seen to be small air-filled spaces, and this, of course, will gradually expand concurrently as we have the increase in the size of the skull. So now, taking each of the paranasal sinuses one after the other, we are going to be driving first into the frontal sinus. The frontal sinus, as the name implies, is seen within the frontal bone. The frontal sinuses, we already said that they are 2 in number. These 2 sinuses are of unequal sizes. And we say that they are paired and, of course, bilateral, which means we have one on the right side and we have another on the left side. So these paranasal sinuses are separated by a bony septum in between. So you have the bony septum separating the sinuses into the right and the left side. And you see that they are specifically located between the junction of the squamous part of the frontal bone and also the medial region of the orbital part of the frontal bone. If you've gone through my lecture on the neurocranium, you know that the frontal bone is subdivided into subregions. We have the squamous part. This squamous in anatomy means it is flat. So it means the flat part of the frontal bone. And this is where you have the superior region of the frontal bone. If you look more inferior, you see that you have the orbital part. This is the orbital part, which forms the supraorbital margin. And you also have one on this side, you have another one on the other side. Then at the middle of the 2 orbital parts, you now have the nasal part. And this is what is highlighted or harrowed here in yellow. So these are the three sub-regions of the frontal bone. But where specifically the frontal sinus is located is at the junction of the squamous part, which is this upper part, and also the medial part of the orbital part. This is the orbital part, this is the medial region of the orbital part, and this is the lateral region. It means that the frontal sinus will be located somewhere around this region. Then you have one on the right and one on the left. So the other one will also be located between the junction of the squamous part of the frontal bone and also the medial region of the orbital part. This is the orbital part of the frontal bone. This is the medial region, and this is the lateral region. So the medial region of the orbital part of the frontal bone, where it forms connection with the squamous part of the frontal bone, at this region is where we have the placement or the location of the frontal sinus. If you look at this image down here, this is where we have the frontal bone. And of course, this is the squamous part. You have the orbital part in the lower part here, and this is the medial part of the orbital part. The junction where the squamous part of the frontal bone meets with the medial part of the orbital region of the frontal bone is where we have the location of the frontal sinus. And this is where the frontal sinus is located, and this is what is arrowed here in green. So you have one on this side and you have another one on this side. This frontal sinus is triangular in shape. It is the most superiorly placed paranasal sinus. If you look at this frontal sinuses, it is seen above the nasal cavity. This is where we have the nasal cavity, and you see that it is the only paranasal sinus that is seen to be located above the nasal cavity. And if you look at its structural configuration, you see that it is triangular in shape, which means that it has three angles, and these three angles can also be surface marked. And how can you do the surface marking of the frontal sinus? If you try to draw a point in the nasum, the roof of the nasal bone, this is where we have the nasal bone, where it forms a connection with the frontal bone. This is where we have the nasum. So if you try to draw a point around this region, then you now measure 3 centimeters above this region. So you go 3 centimeters up. This is where it is marked here. Then on the lateral side, this is the supraorbital margin. To divide the supraorbital margin into 3 parts, we have the medial third, we have the middle third, and you have the lateral third. So the junction between the medial 1/3 and the lateral 2/3 at this junction here is where you have the third point. Because it is triangular in shape, it means it will be having 3 points. If you try to link these 3 points together, then you can have the surface marking or the projected site where the frontal sinus will be located. So you have the point here at the nasum. You make 3 centimeters up above it to this point. Then you now go to the junction where you have the medial 1/3 and the lateral 2/3 here around the supraorbital margin. If you try to join these 3 spots together, you are going to see a triangular projection. And this is how the surface marking of the frontal sinus can be done. So this is how the configuration of the frontal sinus is. So going further, let's look at the ostia of the frontal sinuses. We know we now have 2 frontal sinuses. We have one on the right and we have the other one on the left. And we've said that they are located at the junction where the squamous part of the frontal bone meets with the medial region of the orbital part of the frontal bone. So this is where it's located here in this image. So this is where we have the frontal sinuses. But these frontal sinuses, we already said that they have the same configuration as the nasal cavity. So whatever air that drives into the frontal sinus will also be processed, but it needs also to be linked to the nasal cavity, because it is through the nasal cavity that the air will be pushed down the respiratory tract. So how is this frontal sinuses then able to be linked up with the nasal cavities? Definitely through the ostia. So we have the ostia linking the frontal sinuses to the nasal cavity. Of course, this ostia will be drained into specific region of the nasal cavity. You just don't see them being drained into any region of the nasal cavity. They have specific spots within the nasal cavity that they are drained into. So this frontal sinus is collected through the frontonasal duct. So you have the frontonasal duct here. If you look at this image down here, this is the frontal sinus here that is arrowed in white. If you look down through it, you see the frontonasal duct that is harrowed here in green. It is through this frontonasal duct that the frontal sinus is then linked into the nasal cavity. This is the nasal cavity. It is opened here in this image. This wall that you see is the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. We have done a lecture on the nasal cavity where we describe in details about the configuration of the nasal cavity. In this image, the median septum or the nasal septum is chopped off, so it is not seen in this image, and that is why we have the exposure of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. So you see that this is the frontal sinus, and it is linked through the frontonasal duct. This frontonasal duct that will then be opened into the nasal cavity. And specifically, it will be opened onto the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. And this is where we have the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Well, you see that the path through this region, we have the ethmoidal bone around the roof of the nasal cavity. So definitely the frontonasal duct will be passing through the ethmoidal labyrinth. We'll also be putting up a lecture on the ethmoid bone where we say the specific regions where the ethmoidal labyrinth is located. So there is no how the frontonasal duct will pass through this region without piercing through the ethmoidal labyrinth. So it actually runs through the ethmoidal labyrinth before it can gain access into the nasal cavity. And where it will be opened onto is onto the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. This is where we have the middle meatus. We know that we have the superior concha. This is the superior concha, this is the middle concha, and this is the inferior concha. And in between this concha, we have the meatuses. So between the superior concha and the middle concha, we have the superior meatus. So this is the superior meatus. And between the middle concha and the inferior concha, we have the middle meatus, and this is the middle meatus. Then inferior to the inferior concha, we then have the inferior meatus. So these meatuses are like spaces within the projections that are called the concha. So in the middle meatus, if you look deep through the middle meatus, you see that there are specific or distinct projections also within the middle meatus. Within the middle meatus, we have an elevation that is called the ethmoidal bulla that is harrowed in this image. It's like a swelling within the middle meatus. We say that if we have a swelling, we would at a point have a depression. At the end of this swelling or projection or elevation, we'll definitely be having a depression. So the depression that is created after this ethmoid bulla is seen here, and this is what is also harrowed in this space. And this is referred to as the hiatus semilunaris. So the hiatus semilunaris is like a canal or a gutter that is created after the elevation that is called the ethmoid bulla. So within this is where we have the opening of the frontal sinus, and this is opened through the frontonasal duct. So if you look at the frontonasal duct up here, this is what is harrowed here. You see that it is released into the anterior part of the hiatus semilunaris on the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, because this is actually the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. This is where we have the conchae and also the meatuses. If you look at the anterior part of the hiatus semilunaris here, you see that we have the opening of the frontonasal duct, which is opening that is directed from the frontal sinus. And this is how the configuration is when you try to describe the ostia of the frontal sinus. It's on both the right side and also the left side. So this kind of configuration that we have is on the lateral wall of one side. We'll also be having the opening also of the frontal sinus on the other side, on the lateral wall of the other side. We know that there are two lateral walls. This kind of projection will also be seen on the other side. So if you look at this upper image, this is where we have the frontal sinus. This is one on this side, and this is another one on the other side. So we have the frontonasal duct highlighted in yellow here. You can see it passing through the ethmoidal labyrinth. The structure that is highlighted in black is the ethmoid bone. And we know that the ethmoid bone has different regions. One of the regions of the ethmoid bone is the ethmoidal labyrinth that is located on the lateral side of the ethmoid bone. And this is what is seen in this image. So you see that the frontal sinus draining through the frontonasal duct will not be seen to have another path to run, except passing through the ethmoidal labyrinth. And this is why we say that the frontonasal duct need to pass through the ethmoidal labyrinth before it is then released into the anterior part of the hiatus semilunaris, which is located in the middle meatus. So the frontal sinus is actually opened into the middle meatus. But when you talk in terms of the specific region of the middle meatus that it is opened into, then it is the anterior part of the hiatus semilunaris. And this is where the frontonasal duct on the other side also opens into the middle meatus of the nasal cavity, of course, passing through the ethmoidal labyrinth. So talking about the blood supply of the frontal sinuses, the frontal sinuses is supplied by branches from the supraorbital artery. This is the frontal sinus in this image down here. And we know that the frontal sinuses are located in the anterior part, of course, above the nasal cavity. This is the nasal cavity down here. It is the only paranasal sinus that is seen to be located above the nasal cavity. And we already stated in our previous slide the specific region where this frontal sinus is located. So if you look at this image down, where it is harrowed here in yellow, this is where we have the common carotid artery. We know that the common carotid will further divide into the internal carotid, which is highlighted here in red and also arrowed in black. And we also have the external carotid, which is arrowed here in purple. So the internal carotid will further go into the cranium, where it, of course, will be giving off a number of branches. And one of the branches will be the ophthalmic artery. And this is the ophthalmic artery here that is also arrowed in black. It is this ophthalmic artery that will finally give off the supraorbital artery. And this is the supraorbital artery here, going to supply the frontal sinus. So this is where we have the emergence of the supraorbital artery. We also have the anterior ethmoidal artery. The anterior ethmoidal artery is also a branch of the ophthalmic artery. This is where we have the ophthalmic artery as a branch of the internal carotid artery, which of course branches from the common carotid. So from the ophthalmic artery, we also have the emergence of the anterior ethmoidal artery. So these two arteries are seen to provide blood supply for the frontal sinus. Then, of course, the venous drainage is through the superior ophthalmic vein. The frontal sinus is innervated by the supraorbital nerve. If you look at this image up here, this is where we have the trigeminal nerve. We know that the trigeminal nerve has three subdivisions. We have the ophthalmic, we have the maxillary, and we have the mandibular branch. So this ophthalmic branch will further give off a frontal nerve. This is what is already in red. The frontal nerve then parts further towards the region where we have the frontal sinus. And you see it giving off the supraorbital nerve and also the supratrochlear nerve. This is the supratrochlear nerve here, but this supraorbital nerve is what is seen to innervate the wall of the frontal sinus. Then the lymphatic drainage is into the submandibular node. Now let's drive in and continue with this lecture going through the sphenoidal sinus. The sphenoidal sinus, just as the name implies, is located within the sphenoid bone. Specifically, it is located within the body of the sphenoid. You look at this configuration here, this is the body of the sphenoid bone here, highlighted in black. And we know that the sphenoid bone is seen to have two wings. It has a greater wing and it has a lesser wing here that is highlighted in green. It also has two limbs. It has a medial and lateral limbs, which are called the pterygoid plates. So this is the configuration of the sphenoid bone, but specifically where these hair feet spaces are located is within the body of the sphenoid. And this is what is highlighted here in black. So you have two, you have one on the right, you have one on the left. As we've stated in our previous slide, that the paranasal sinuses are paired sinuses and are bilateral, which means you have one on one side and you have the other on the other side. So there are two, and they are seen within the body of the sphenoid. If you look at this image up here, this is where we have the body of the sphenoid bone here, that is highlighted in red, where we have other processes emerging from the body, just as what we've seen here in this image. And if you look at this image down here, this is the space where we have the nasal cavity. This is the frontal sinus that we described in our previous slide that is located above the nasal cavity. So if you look at the nasal cavity behind here is where we have the sphenoidal sinus. So this is where the sphenoidal sinus is located within the body of the sphenoid bone. So going back to this image up here, this is where we have the sphenoidal sinus. You have one on this side and you have another one on the other side, of course, located within the body of the sphenoid bone. And you see this sinus is separated at the center by this septum. And this is the septum that is harrowed here in black. So you have the septum separating this healthy space into two. So we have one on the right and the other one on the left. So this is where this separation is. Of course, the two are located or seen within the body of the sphenoid. And if you look above the body of the sphenoid bone, you see the region that is referred to as the sella tussica. The sella tussica is seen to have a depression that is called the hypophyseal fossa. This hypophyseal fossa is created to accommodate the pituitary gland. And this is the region here, harrowed in green. You have a depressed region or a fossa that is created to accommodate the pituitary gland. And this is the pituitary gland here highlighted in black. It's good for us to also be able to establish this. Talking about the ostia, where the two sphenoidal sinuses will be drained into, we already said that the paranasal sinuses are seen to be collected into the nasal cavity and are seen to be drained into the lateral wall and also the roof of the nasal cavity. For the frontal sinus, it is seen to drain into the upper part of the hiatus semilunaris. We already described this in our previous slide. So talking about the configuration of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, we have the conchae, which are the superior, the middle, and the inferior conchae. So this is where we have the superior conchae. The superior conchae, if you look at it, or posterior to it, you have a depression or a hollow space that is created here, and this is called a recess. And the name of this recess is the sphenoethmoidal recess, which is a recess that is created between the sphenoid bone behind and also the ethmoidal bone at the front. So if you try to break down the name, you can actually be able to establish where this recess is created. So you have a depression created at this point, which is called the sphenoethmoidal recess, that is located around the roof of the nasal cavity. This is actually the configuration of the roof of the nasal cavity, both at the posterior side of the roof of the nasal cavity, because we actually stated in our previous slide that the sphenoidal sinus is located behind the nasal cavity. So it is located at the posterior part of the nasal cavity. So you have the sphenoethmoidal recess. This is where the opening of the sphenoidal sinus is released into. So this is what receives the opening of the sphenoidal sinus. So this is where we have the superior concha. So if you look at it behind, you have this depression created at that spot that is called the sphenoethmoidal recess. And that is what actually receives the ostia of the sphenoidal sinuses. So this is where the sphenoethmoidal recess is located. So now going further, talking about the blood supply, the innervation, and also the lymphatics of the sphenoidal sinuses. For the blood supply of the sphenoidal sinus, it is supplied by the posterior ethmoidal artery. The posterior ethmoidal artery is a branch of the ophthalmic artery. This is where we have the common carotid dividing into the internal and the external carotid, here highlighted in green. The internal carotid will then further give off the ophthalmic. It is from this ophthalmic artery that you have the posterior ethmoidal artery. This is the posterior ethmoidal artery. This is where we have the anterior ethmoidal artery, which we described in our previous slide, supplying the frontal sinus. You can see it is in the anterior part. So it is this branch that will normally give supply to the frontal sinus because it is located close to it. So the posterior ethmoidal artery is located behind, of course, located close to the sphenoidal sinus. And that is why it is giving off branch to supply the sinus behind. So ordinarily, we may not need to cram this. If you look at the position of these vessels, we may be able to justify the reasons why they are supplying the specific regions that they give branches to supply. So for the posterior ethmoidal artery that is harrowed here in white, you see it as an emergence of the ophthalmic. Then you see it giving off branches, to supply the sphenoidal sinus. And this is what is highlighted here in black and also arrowed in white. Then it's also supplied by the pharyngeal branches. The pharyngeal branches are from the maxillary artery. This is where we have the external carotid artery, which is highlighted here in green. So from the External carotid, we have the facial branch here, then we have the maxillary branch here. It is this maxillary branch that then give off the pharyngeal branches, which also give branches to supply the sphenoidal sinuses. Then the venous drainage is into the superior ophthalmic vein. For the innervation, it is innervated by the posterior ethmoidal nerve. The posterior ethmoidal nerve is a branch of the nasociliary nerve. We've highlighted this in our innervation lecture of the nasal cavity. If not, check that lecture up. It's a part 3 lecture on the nasal cavity. Please kindly go and check that lecture up to understand the emergence of the posterior ethmoidal nerve. So if you look at this configuration here, this is where we have the trigeminal nerve. We know that the trigeminal nerve will give off the ophthalmic, which is the first branch of the trigeminal nerve. The ophthalmic nerve will then further give a nasociliary nerve. This is a nasociliary nerve. So if you try to break down the name of nasociliary nerve, it means it will be giving off branches that will supply the nasal region and also the ciliary region, which is the high region. So you have the nasociliary nerve here, giving up the nasal branches and also the ciliary branches. So these are the ciliary branches here. It's going towards the high region. Then you have the nasal branches here, of course, being directed towards the nasal cavity. So it is from the nasal branches that we have the posterior ethmoidal nerve. So this is the posterior ethmoidal nerve here, harrowed in black. This is the anterior ethmoidal nerve here at the front, but it is this posterior ethmoidal that gives innervation to the sphenoidal sinus. Then it also receives branches from the pterygopalatine ganglion. We know that the pterygopalatine ganglion is a collection of cell body that is located inferior to the maxillary nerve. So from this region, it gives off orbital branches that also help to give innervation to the sphenoidal sinuses. Then the lymphatic is into the retropharyngeal nodes. You can see that the sphenoidal sinus is draining to a different node, while the frontal sinus, of course, is draining to the submandibular node. So this sphenoidal sinus is seen to be draining to the retropharyngeal nodes. So as we are moving further, let's look at the ethmoidal sinuses. The ethmoidal sinuses is one of the interesting paranasal sinuses. And of course, as the name implies, it is located within the ethmoid bone. So if you look at this configuration up here, this is where we have the cranial cavity up. Down we have the oral cavity. Of course, inferior to the cranial cavity, we have the socket. This is where we have the eye. And in between the eye, around the roof of the nasal cavity, we have the ethmoidal bone. This is the ethmoidal bone here that is highlighted here in black. We know that the ethmoidal bone has different sub-regions, and we'll be looking into that as we go through with this lecture. So where specifically is the ethmoidal sinus? So it is located specifically in the ethmoidal labyrinth. The ethmoidal labyrinth is seen to be located between the medial wall of the orbit. This is the orbit here, and this is the medial wall of the orbit. This is the lateral wall of the orbit. So it's located between the medial wall of the orbit and also the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. This is where we have the nasal cavity, and this is the lateral wall of the nasal cavity on both sides. So you see that it is seen to be located between the lateral wall of the nasal cavity and also the medial wall of the orbit. So this is where we have the ethmoidal sinus located here, that is arrowed in yellow. So you have group of sinuses here that are referred to as the ethmoidal sinus. And this is what is seen here in this image. If you try to look at the configuration of the ethmoid bone, you see that it has the perpendicular plate of ethmoid. This is what is harrowed here in purple. This perpendicular plate of ethmoid is like a perpendicular plate that seems to run down from the ethmoidal bone. And you see it connecting with the vomer at the inferior part to form the bony part of the nasal septum. We've also described this in our previous lecture on the nasal cavity. This is the part 1 lecture on the nasal cavity. Now also go and check that up to see the configuration of both the medial and the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. So for the medial wall, which of course is the septal wall, or the nasal septum of the nasal cavity, is formed by the perpendicular plate of ethmoid at its superior 2/3, while the inferior 1/3 is formed by the vomer. And this is what this alignment shows in this image. So you have the perpendicular plate running downwards, of course, forming a connection with the vomer. And these two structures is seen to partition the nasal cavity and dividing it into the two spaces that is made up of. So we have one nasal cavity here and we have another nasal cavity here, of course, separated by the median septum. Then if you go up, you have the cribriform plate of ethmoid. This is the cribriform plate of ethmoid, a transversely placed section that is called the cribriform plate of ethmoid. On this cribriform plate, you have foramina, and this is what gives it a sieve appearance. So you see these holes created so that the axon of the olfactory nerve can pass through and enter into the cranium, where to be delivering the sensory impulses to the olfactory cortex. So that is why we have the creation of this hole on the cribriform plate of ethmoid. And this cribriform plate is seen at the roof of the nasal cavity. Then you also have an extension from the cribriform plate here that is also arrowed in purple that is called the crystal galley. This crystal galley forms a connection with the fast cerebri. The fast cerebri is a fold of dural matter that helps to separate the two cerebral hemispheres within the cranial cavity. So this is like giving a structural connection to the contents of the cranial cavity. So you have this crystal galley here. And on the lateral side of the ethmoid bone, you have the ethmoidal labyrinth. So this is the ethmoidal labyrinth on this side, and this is the ethmoidal labyrinth on the other side. So it is within this ethmoidal labyrinth that you have the location of the ethmoidal sinuses. So you see it's located because it's on the lateral side of the ethmoid bone. You see it being sandwiched between the medial wall of the orbit and also the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. So you have the medial wall of the orbit here, and you have the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, and you see this ethmoidal air sinuses being sandwiched between these two structures. And that is why it is located between the medial wall of the orbit and also the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, because it is located within the ethmoidal labyrinth. Because the ethmoidal labyrinth is seen at the lateral part of the ethmoid bone, where we have this perpendicular plate of ethmoid there. You have the cribriform plate up here, then you have the crystal galley as an extension above the cribriform plate of ethmoid. So this is the configuration of the ethmoid bone. So now you can see specifically the region of the ethmoid where the ethmoidal sinus is located. So this is where you have the orbit. And if you look at the configuration of the orbit, you have the lateral wall on this lateral side. Then you have the medial wall on this side. And of course, this is another orbit on the other side, having a medial wall and a lateral wall. So you see the ethmoidal hair sinus being sandwiched between the medial wall of the orbit and also the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. So that is how that is placed. There is a structure that is referred to as the lamina papyracea. This structure is very important because it helps to act like a barrier between the ethmoidal sinuses and also the content of the orbit. This is where we have the orbit here, and this is where we have the ethmoidal sinuses. So you see this lamina papyracea highlighted here in green, and you see it acting like a barricade or a barrier between the orbit and also the ethmoidal sinuses. So it's helping to act like a structural guide, separating the structures that are located within the orbit and also the ethmoidal sinuses. And you also have this structure on the other side too, also trying to, separate the ethmoidal sinus from the orbital region. So you see it lining the medial wall of the orbit, where it is forming connection with the ethmoidal sinuses. So going further on the ethmoidal sinus, this is the frontal sinus here that is harrowed, and posteriorly we have the sphenoidal sinus behind. The ethmoidal sinus is not seen in this image. Why? Because this is the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, and we already said that the ethmoidal sinuses and the maxillary sinuses are located at the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. This is chopped off in this image because this image, the nasal septum is removed, and what is seen here is the lateral wall. So the only two sinuses that can be projected in this image is the frontal and the sphenoidal sinus. Also to add that the ethmoidal sinuses are not seen as single air-filled spaces, just as what is presented in the frontal sinus and the sphenoidal sinus or the maxillary sinus. The ethmoidal sinus is seen as small air-filled spaces that are separated by septa. So if you look at this configuration up here, you see that it is not a single air-filled space, and what is projected down here in the frontal sinus. So you see collection of sinuses, of air-filled spaces that are separated by septa. So it is not like a single air-filled space as what is seen in other sinus. So this is what is distinct about the ethmoidal sinus. And of course, this collection of air-filled spaces that are separated by septa are further subdivided into the anterior, the middle, and posterior ethmoidal sinuses. So we have this collection or group of air sinuses being divided into three sub-regions. So we have the anterior, we have the middle, and we have the posterior ethmoidal sinuses, just for us to also know this. So going further on the ethmoidal ostia, where the ethmoidal sinuses are seen to connect or open into the nasal cavity, because they actually need to be connected to the nasal cavity, so that whatever air that is processed within them will further be delivered into the nasal cavity, and from the nasal cavity will be directed down into the respiratory tract. So because we have three subgroups, as we've highlighted in our previous slide, and these names are so given based on the regions of the nasal cavity that they are drained into. So the names of the different subregions or subdivisions of the ethmoidal sinuses are given based on the region of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity that they are drained into. Because we already stated in our previous slide that the paranasal sinuses are drained into the lateral wall of the nasal cavity and also the roof of the nasal cavity. We already described the ostia of the sphenoidal sinus, where it is drained into the roof of the nasal cavity, specifically in the sphenoethmoidal recess. But for other paranasal sinuses, which include the frontal sinus, the ethmoidal sinus, and the maxillary sinus, they are all drained into the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, except the sphenoidal sinus that is drained into the roof of the nasal cavity. So going back to the ethmoidal sinuses, they are divided into three subgroups. This is where we have the ethmoidal sinus. We already described this specific position in our previous slide, that they are located within the ethmoidal labyrinth. And they are seen as collection of small air-filled spaces, not like a single air-filled space as projected by the frontal, the maxillary, and also the sphenoidal sinuses. So this is what is distinct about the ethmoidal sinus. So talking about the subdivisions of the ethmoidal sinus, we have the anterior ethmoidal sinus. This anterior ethmoidal sinus is delivered or opened into the hiatus semilunaris, in the middle meatus. We already described the hiatus semilunaris in our previous slide when we tried to describe the ostia of the frontal sinus. This is where we have the frontal sinus, and we say the frontal sinus drains through the frontonasal duct, where it opens into the anterior part of the hiatus semilunaris, which is a depression that is created after the ethmoid bulla, or the bulla ethmoidalis. So we already described this in our previous slide. So this is where we have the middle meatus. We already know where the middle meatus is located, between the middle and the inferior concha. So this is where we have the superior meatus and the inferior meatus. We already stated in our previous slide that within the middle meatus, we have specific projection. And this specific projection here is the ethmoid bulla. This ethmoid bulla is like an elevation that is created within the middle meatus. And after an elevation, we say we would have a depression. And this depression is what is called the hiatus semilunaris. In the anterior part of the hiatus semilunaris, we have the opening of the frontonasal duct, which is draining the frontal sinus. Of course, also within this frontal part, we also have the opening of the anterior ethmoidal sinus. So this is where we have the opening of the anterior ethmoidal sinus. Also, this specific region is where we have the opening of the frontal sinus. So you can see that the anterior ethmoidal sinus is seen to be opened into the anterior part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Then the second is the middle ethmoidal sinus. The middle ethmoidal sinus is seen to open onto the ethmoid bulla. If you look at this elevation that is referred to as the ethmoid bulla or the bulla ethmoidalis, this elevation also has a hole created on it, and this hole is created for the middle ethmoidal sinuses. So we have the middle ethmoidal sinuses being opened into this region. So as it is going in terms of placement, you see that the middle ethmoidal sinus is seen to be located behind the opening of the anterior ethmoidal sinus. Then going to the posterior ethmoidal sinus, this posterior ethmoidal sinus is seen to be opened behind the opening of the middle ethmoidal sinus. So this is where we have the opening of the posterior ethmoidal sinus. This is where we have the superior meatus. Remember, this is our middle meatus, this is our inferior meatus. So the posterior ethmoidal sinus is seen to be opened into the superior meatus. So if it is opened onto the superior meatus, it means it is located posterior to the opening of the middle ethmoidal sinus. So if you look at this position in terms of how they are placed within the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, you see that the anterior is opened into the anterior part, the middle is opened into the middle part, while the posterior ethmoidal sinus is opened into the posterior part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. And this is where the name is being drafted from. It is based on the position of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity where they are opened into. So then going further on the blood supply and innervation, and also the lymphatics of the ethmoidal sinuses. The ethmoidal sinuses is supplied by the anterior and the posterior ethmoidal artery, and also the supraorbital artery. These three arteries are branches from the ophthalmic, which of course branches from the internal carotid artery. There we have the common carotid dividing into the external carotid and internal carotid. The internal carotid further gives off the ophthalmic artery. It is this ophthalmic that gives off the anterior ethmoidal artery and also the posterior ethmoidal artery that is already engraved. And this ophthalmic also gives off the supraorbital artery that is also already engraved. So these three branches from the ophthalmic will give blood supply to the ethmoidal sinuses. They also receive branches from the sphenopalatine artery. The sphenopalatine artery is a branch of the maxillary artery, which of course branches from the external carotid artery. This is where we have the external carotid, and this is where we have the maxillary artery. The maxillary artery is then seen to give off the sphenopalatine artery, which of course will also give supply to the ethmoidal sinuses. Then the venous drainage is into the superior ophthalmic vein, where we have the innervation from the anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerve. We already know that the anterior and the posterior ethmoidal nerve are branches from the nasociliary nerve, which of course comes from the ophthalmic, and ophthalmic is a branch of the trigeminal. So this is where we have the trigeminal ganglion giving off the ophthalmic nerve. The ophthalmic nerve gives off the nasociliary nerve. The nasociliary nerve is what then gives off the anterior and the posterior ethmoidal nerve. This anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerve are seen to innervate the ethmoidal sinuses. We also have orbital branches from the pterygopalatine ganglion, and this we've also described in our previous slide. Then the lymphatics is drained into the submandibular nodes. So going further, let's look at the maxillary sinuses. Just from the name, air-filled spaces that are located within the body of the maxilla. So the maxillary sinus is also referred to as the atrium of Hymo. So we have the maxillary sinus here located in this image up here. This is where we have the ethmoidal sinus, and inferior to it on the lateral side is where we have the maxillary sinus. We already stated in our previous slide that the ethmoidal and the maxillary sinus are located on the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. One is located above, more medially, while one is located inferiorly, of course, more laterally. So we have the maxillary sinus located more inferior laterally to the ethmoidal sinus, because they are both seen on the lateral side of the nasal cavity. So this is where we have the maxillary sinus here arrayed in black, and you have two. You have one on this side and you have one on the other side, because we say that they are paired and also bilateral. In this image down here, this is where we have the maxillary sinus here arrayed in black. So you have one on this side and you have another one on the other side. In this image up here, the maxillary sinus is opened in this image. So it's cracked open here. So this is what the interior of the maxillary sinus looks like. This maxillary sinus is pyramidal in shape. It is the largest of all the paranasal sinuses. It's seen as a small air-filled space, which we tend to increase as the skull also expands. So as there is a concurrent increase in the size of the skull, this maxillary sinus also takes its place and also begins to expand according to the expansion of the skull. So you see, this is where it is located, and it of course is open in this image, as we've said. So it is the first to develop. Of course, then it begins to increase in size. The pyramidal pattern means it will have an apex. The apex of the maxillary sinus is directed towards the zygomatic process of the maxilla. This is where we have the maxilla, and you see the zygomatic process, which is the process of the maxilla that is directed or connected to the zygomatic bone. Where we have the zygomatic bone around this region. So you have the maxillary bone having a connection with the zygomatic bone through the zygomatic process. And this is where the apex of the maxillary sinus is directed towards. Then we have the base along the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. So this is where we have the base of the maxillary sinus, because we say it is pyramidal in shape. So the base will be along the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, while the apex will be directed towards the zygomatic process of the maxilla. So that is how that configuration is done. And if you look at this image up here, this is where we have the maxillary sinus. We say it is cracked open in this image. This is where we have the zygomatic bone, which is the cheekbone. If you look at this configuration, you see above here is where we have the orbit. And this is where the roof of the maxillary sinus is connected with. So it has a connection with the orbit above. While inferiorly, you have a connection with the alveoli process. You have the alveoli process at the inferior part. This is what forms the floor of the maxillary sinus. If you look at the medial side, you see that we already said that the base forms an alignment with the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. This region here is where we have the nose. This is where the nasal cavity is located. So you see that it is located on the lateral side of the nasal cavity. So this is how the maxillary sinus is configured and also positioned. And if you try to compare it with the position of the ethmoidal sinus, we've highlighted this previously. You see that the ethmoidal sinus is located above, while the maxillary sinus is located below, even though they are both located on the lateral wall. So while we have the ethmoidal more medially placed, the maxillary sinus is more laterally placed. So it's good for us to be able to distinct these positions. So talking about the ostia of the maxillary sinus, this is an interesting part. It's also opened into the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. We said the paranasal sinuses are either opened into the lateral wall or the roof. Look at the way it is configured. They are drained into the posterior part of the hiatus semilunaris. We already described this hiatus semilunaris in our previous slide. This is where we have the maxillary sinus. And if you see the opening, it's at the upper part of the maxillary sinus, which means this opening is against gravity. And what this means is that there's going to be retention of secrets within the maxillary sinus. So if you look at the configuration of this image here, we already stated that we have the middle meatus. This is the middle meatus. And within the middle meatus is where we have the opening of the maxillary sinus, because within the middle meatus, we have a number of transformations. We have the ethmoid bulla up here. Inferior to it, we have the hiatus semilunaris. We already described this in our previous slide, that the anterior part of the hiatus semilunaris receives the frontal sinus and also the anterior ethmoidal sinuses. So if you go down the hiatus semilunaris at the posterior part is where we have the opening of the maxillary sinus. So the maxillary sinus is also opened into the hiatus semilunaris, but it is opened and specifically in the posterior part of the hiatus semilunaris. And if you look at this image, this is where we have the maxillary sinus, of course, opening or draining into the hiatus semilunaris by the posterior part. They have the other side too being drained into the middle meatus, specifically at the posterior part of the hiatus semilunaris. So going back to the configuration here, this is the maxillary sinus. We say the opening of the maxillary sinus, which is the ostium on this side, is opened at the superior part of the maxillary sinus, which means that it is against gravity. And this will make it difficult for secrets to be completely drained out of the maxillary sinus. And what this means is that there's going to be an accumulation of fluid. And when this accumulates over time, it can be infected. So talking about the blood supply, the innervation and also the lymphatics, the blood supply of the maxillary sinus is by the infraorbital artery, the supraalveolar artery, and also the greater palatine artery. All these arteries are branches of the maxillary artery, which of course emerge from the external carotid. So this is where we have the maxillary artery. It's giving off these three branches to supply the maxillary sinus. Of course, we know that the maxillary artery is a branch from the external carotid, which of course emerge from the common carotid, where we have the venous drainage into the pterygoid plexus. For the innervation, the maxillary sinus is innervated by the infraorbital nerve and also the posterior branch of the superior alveoli nerve. Let's drive into this image down here. This is where we have the trigeminal nerve giving off the maxillary nerve, which is the second branch of the trigeminal nerve. For the maxillary nerve, you see it giving off the posterior branch of the superior alveoli nerve. This posterior branch of the superior alveolar nerve is a direct branch from the maxillary nerve. Then you see it continuing has the infraorbital nerve, and this is the infraorbital nerve within the infraorbital canal. So this infraorbital nerve will then further give off the anterior and the middle branches of the superior alveoli nerve. And this is what we have here. This is the anterior branch, this is the middle branch. So if you look at this configuration, you see that the anterior and the middle branches of the superior alveolar nerve are from the infraorbital nerve. And the infraorbital nerve, of course, is a branch from the maxillary nerve. But for the posterior posterior branch of the superior alveolar nerve is a direct branch of the maxillary nerve. So it's good for us to be able to establish the emergence of the anterior, the middle, and the posterior branches of the superior alveolar nerves. And these nerves are seen to innervate the maxillary sinus. But it's good for us to be able to establish how they emerge. For the anterior and the middle, they emerge from the infraorbital, while the posterior branch will emerge directly from the maxillary nerve. While the lymphatics is into the submandibular nodes. So talking about clinical anatomy, sinusitis is an inflammation of the mucosal lining of the paranasal sinuses. So any inflammation or diseases of the upper respiratory tract can be spread into the paranasal sinuses. Remember, there's a connection point, which are the ostia, through which the paranasal sinuses are connected to the centrally placed nasal cavity. Talking about the configuration of the sphenoid bone, when we try to describe the sphenoidal sinuses, we say these sinuses are located within the body of the sphenoid bone. If you look at the cranial surface or the upper surface of the sphenoid bone, we have the sella tussica, and this sella tussica has a depression that is referred to as the hypophyseal fossa, which helps to accommodate the pituitary gland. So when there is need for surgery of the pituitary gland can be accessed through this part by directing access through the sphenoidal sinus, then up through the hypophyseal fossa, where the pituitary gland is located. With this, there will not be the need for a more extensive craniotomy. And this is specifically referred to as the endoscopic trans-sphenoidal or trans-nasal surgery. So this surgery is specifically to access the pituitary gland through the sphenoidal sinus. So let's check our understanding of this lecture through the following questions. And the first one is to describe the frontal sinuses. Second question is to highlight the different subregions where all the paranasal sinuses are drained into. We already stated during the course of this lecture that the paranasal sinuses are either drained onto the lateral wall or the roof of the nasal cavity. Then the third question is to describe the ethmoidal sinuses. The fourth question is, what is antrium hiemor? Then the last question is, what is endoscopic trans-sphenoidal surgery? So thanks for watching this video. Let's meet again.